We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Simpson Center for Food and Agricultural Policy webinar, Fertilizer Futures and Frameworks, Nitrous Dioxide Emissions. I would also like to take this time to acknowledge our webinar is part of a larger public education series on the carbon program, which is generously sponsored by UFA and RCF. Today's topic is focused on fertilizer use in crop production. The Simpson Center's carbon program aims to better quantify Canada's fertilizer emissions in the crop sector and identify strategies to mitigate direct fertilizer emissions into the future. Before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time, or you're experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in the webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. There's a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your questions to the panel at any time today. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click the thumbs up icon on the question to move it in front of the queue. And the structure of today's webinar will consist of one presentation split into two sections. And at the end of each section, we're going to have a poll question as well as an opportunity for you to ask some questions. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation, but please note they will not be posed to the panelists until the end of the webinar, or the end of the section, I should say. So now please join me in welcoming our two wonderful presenters today. Presenting first, we will have Scott Bolton, the President and CEO of UFA. Scott is going to be sharing some words about the public education series. So take it away, Scott.
Sean, thank you for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to just say a few short words to set the table for our next presenter and the discussion to follow. First off, on behalf of UFA and our Rural Communities Foundation, I want to welcome you to the latest in the series of Simpson Center webinars addressing key policy issues impacting Canadian agriculture. As one of Canada's largest agricultural cooperatives with over 120,000 members operating in 3 provinces, we are a proud supporter of the Simpson Center and the vitally important work that they do, and we in strengthening Canadian policymaking in this most fundamentally important industry. The topic of fertilizer use in crop production, and specifically the federal government's 30% by 2030 reduction pledge, is needless to say contentious. Few policy issues in recent memory in any sector have garnered this much public attention and angered so many industry stakeholders. This includes many members of our cooperative, to be honest with you. You should not underestimate the sensitivity of this issue in our rural farming communities. I think the root cause of the reaction is twofold. The 30% reduction was announced without sufficient consultation with our industry, particularly at the primary producer level. The rationale supporting the pledge target and timing and other details, I would submit, was not well communicated or substantiated either. And I think on top of this, the timing of the announcement and its deficiencies, coming as it did in an environment in our rural communities where there is already a significant degree of disenchantment with government and our institutions, is not helpful. It's worth stating, however, that the goal of reducing fertilizer usage is something primary producers completely support. Doing more with less is what farmers do every day. In 2 generations, we've doubled food production globally, which has lifted 1 billion human beings out of poverty. And we can do it again, but only if primary producers are in the tent and the rule of science prevails. And I haven't even mentioned the war in Ukraine. If this war coming on the heels of the pandemic has taught us one thing, food security is as vital an issue as we face on our planet today. In the immediate term, I suggest it trumps all others. We take food security for granted at our own peril. That's maybe the way to put it. So the stakes are high. How do we thread the needle of developing policy to deal with climate change and sustainability while not jeopardizing the most basic requirement for society's preservation and advancement, namely food security? And this is where organizations like the Simpson Center play such a crucial role. It starts with the setting out of the science and the facts upon which we can build policy and gain stakeholder support for its goals and the plan to get there. This webinar today is going to address a key question, which must be answered scientifically. What are our nitrogen fertilizer emissions? And how do they compare with others? And what are cost benefits of enhanced efficiency techniques on carbon pricing? I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I'll turn it back over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. We really appreciate your support of this webinar, as well as the other webinars that we have at the Simpson Center. It's now my pleasure to hand it over to my colleague, Joshua Barassa, who's going to tell you about the carbon program. And I apologize, I misspoke earlier, nitrous oxide emissions.
Thank you, Sean. Just want to make sure everything's good. Or is it the wrong screen again?
Nope, you are on the right screen.
Oh. No, I'm not. There we go.
Yeah,
all right.
That's good.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Josh Barassa. I'm a research associate at the Simpson Center and research lead on the carbon program. Like Sean said earlier, the carbon program is an applied policy or public policy research and outreach project funded by the province of Alberta, and was the first major research program at the Simpson Center. Our work at the carbon program can be really summed up, although slightly jokingly, as this fairly simple research question. How can Alberta's ag sector reduce its greenhouse gas emissions while increasing production to meet global demand, while also increasing competitiveness in a global market? So I guess I had quite a simple question to answer. So for today, we'll be discussing nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use. This topic has been in the news quite a bit over the past year, and it has been really one of my main research focus with the carbon program for the past year and a half. This presentation will cover some of our recent reports, and hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion about how can Canadian producers meet this fertilizer-based emission reduction target by 2030. So for this presentation, we'll first start off by going through essentially how emissions are estimated and how Canadian methodology compares to other countries and some of the policy implications of methodology and methodology development. The second, we'll look at some of the effectiveness of different enhanced efficiency or the effectiveness of different near-term mitigation strategies. And we'll really be focusing in on strategies presented in the AFC discussion document published in February of this year. And then lastly, we'll go over a bit of a case study that we recently published on enhanced efficiency fertilizer adoption in Alberta, as well as the expected changes to net revenue at differing offset prices. So before we begin, I'll hand it back to our moderator for our first question to the audience.
Yeah, so our first question for you today is a poll question. So just please select one of the answers and then hit submit. The question is, do you think Canadian farmers can reduce fertilizer-based emissions by 30%? And your options are yes, no, or unsure. We'll give you a couple minutes here to answer this question, and then we will provide you with the answer. All right. And so the question, do you think Canadian farmers can reduce fertilizer-based emissions by 30%? 31% of you said yes, 35% of you said no, and 35% of you said unsure. So pretty split amongst the three options. Josh, I don't know if you want to provide some analysis on that before you move on.
That closely resembles my thoughts on a day-to-day basis, to be completely honest. All right, so to start off, I think, why are we talking about emission methodology in a policy discussion? And this is a question that I have continually asked myself throughout the carbon program. When joining in the project and starting on a lot of this work, I initially thought that there would be very clear models that have been developed to estimate emissions, and they would follow a standardized and agreed upon methodology that was detailed and widely used and accepted. And while this is the case for some emission sources, this is definitely not the case for nitrous oxide. So going back to the question of why emission methodology is important in a policy discussion, and kind of broke it down to these three main areas. First, the methodology used will have a significant effect on the estimated value. And while there are a number of estimates out there for different things, like the amount of emissions being generated from agriculture or emissions from nitrogen or just general crop production, if the methodology being selected is being used in something like Canada's National Inventory Report, which is reported annually to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the measurements being used are what's being used to drive Canadian environmental policy, as well as being the metric used to determine whether or not Canada meets different international commitments, like the Paris Agreement, or to a lesser extent, something like the Global Methane Pledge that it signed up for last year. Second is the variables included within the model will determine what mitigation practices will result in measurable emission reductions. And I bolded and underlined measurable, just really to be really draw attention to it. A producer could adopt every best management or beneficial management practice, as well as a full suite of 4R practices. But if the methodology does not include what they are doing, it may not show up in the emission estimate from that farm, which will have very large effects on total once you start aggregating up to the national level. And then lastly, there is very limited value in these emission comparisons if the methodology used is not similar to one another, and if there's, especially if there's very large differences in the quality of the estimate being shown. So highlighting all three of these points is the figure up on the slide. What you can see is three estimates of emissions for 2019 from direct nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soils. Shown in the blue is using the IPCC Tier 1 default approach. This is an international standard. Shown in the yellow is Canada's previous national emission methodology. And shown in the gray is Canada's current emission methodology. All three of these are going to be using the same underlying data. And what you can see is that there's very large differences in the outcome based off of the methodological choice. So we have between the IPCC and Canada's current methodology a 50% reduction, or approximately 50% reduction in emissions as a result of the methodology choice. And when comparing between the 2021 and the 2022 methodology, again, there's about a 30% difference or between or 30% reduction between the two. Now, when we're looking at how emissions are estimated, really in its simplest form, what's happening is that there's the amount of nitrogen being applied. So in Canada, or for this measurement, is going to be kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer, is being multiplied by an emission factor, with the emission factor being very variable or depending on the regions. If we are using a tier 1 approach, that first equation is going to be what is being used. And the emission factor being applied is going to be about 1%, or 1% of total nitrogen applied is then being re-emitted. So again, it is a very back of the envelope calculation. Now, these methodologies can be improved quite a bit, and this generally takes the form of differentiating the emission factors. So a separate emission factor for different practices being used. So it could be a single value, like in the case of Germany, or it could take on the form of like 1 or 2 different emission factors by nitrogen source or by soil type. But these are still quite simple approaches. I will say Canada does have a very well-developed emission methodology when comparing. And what we end up seeing, while it is quite a bit more developed, using regional emission factors estimated based off of environmental characteristics and then modified by management practices, it still follows the same form of nitrogen usage multiplied by an emission factor. What is also beneficial with the Canadian approach is that it is quite, while it does look fairly complicated, it is quite transparent in terms of what practice has what impact on emissions. And this is something that not all countries have. Some of them are going to be fairly difficult to see how one approach, say like the adoption of no-till, will affect total emissions. And that does create a lot of issues around policy development. So the figure shown above on the x-axis, what we're going to see is the different variables generally included. So we have climate, annual weather, usually shown in rainfall, and potential of evapotranspiration. We have soil type or production type and irrigation. And then on the y-axis, we have different countries' methodologies being used. So earlier this year, we ended up conducting a review of all 42 countries that submit their national inventory report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what we ended up finding was that the majority, 33 at the time, were using the IPCC default value of 1%. And when countries were developing their own approaches, they were very much focusing on environmental characteristics driving emissions, and not so much the practices that farmers could actually adopt to reduce emissions on the farm. This does have a very important impact, important impact that if farmers are to reduce emissions, and the methodology only accounts for environmental characteristics, there's no levers that farmers can pull other than to reduce nitrogen use. And so we see that in the case of something like Germany or the Netherlands, where they look at soil type and production type. And even in the case of something like Australia, where they have multiple variables, climate, soil type, or production type and irrigation, farmers aren't going to be going on and off, or being irrigated to not irrigated to reduce emissions, especially in very arid environments. When looking at mitigation strategies, there are very few countries that include something like enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers. And what we found was only Ireland and Japan currently have incorporated EENF use in their models. And so going into some of these near-term mitigation strategies, this table was taken for the most part from a discussion document published by AAFC in February of this year, which was being used as part of the public consultation project or part of public consultation for the fertilizer-based emission reduction target. What we see is that the targets has mainly focused, or how we are to meet the goal or to meet the target has primarily focused on 4R practices, rate, or applying the right rate at the right time, using at the right place, using the right source. But when we're looking at whether or not these practices are included in the methodology, currently only the use of organic fertilizer, the use of conventional tillage, and increasing the amount of legumes in the rotation would be directly incorporated within the Canadian approach. There are several variables that are indirectly accounted for just based off of changes in nitrogen application. So either annual soil testing with spring application or nitrogen credits, or something like split application with that is applied at a sensor adjusted rate, will be indirectly included only if they result in decreases in nitrous oxide or decreases in nitrogen fertilizer use. What is concerning is that over 50% or 62% of the target can be met with enhanced efficiency fertilizer adoption if full adoption were to occur, and 50% of the total potential nitrous oxide mitigation is being attributed to enhanced efficiency fertilizer use, and that value is not incorporated within the methodology, which makes it extremely difficult for, or really impossible for Canada to meet the target without for further developing the model to include this, and then also making sure that those values are appropriate across Canada and across different regions. So going to our next group question.
Perfect. So we have our next poll question. Our question is, do you think Canadian farmers will meet the fertilizer-based emission target by 2030? And again, your answer options are yes, no, and unsure. And while we're waiting for you to fill this out, I'll also just remind you that if you'd like to put in a question in the Q&A section, we would welcome you to do so now, because we will be moving on to a discussion after we are done the poll question. So I would welcome any questions around what the material that we have just heard from Josh. And a reminder to do that, you can just put the questions in the Q&A box, but we should have our poll answers popping up here. So the question was, do you think Canadian farmers will meet the fertilizer-based emission target by 2030? 9% of you said yes, 53% of you said no, and 38% of you said unsure. So Josh, I don't know if you'd like to speak to this, but there is some interesting results here.
I have to remember to mute myself. Yeah, I definitely, it's going to be extremely hard to actually meet that target, especially given the lack of available information and the current state of Canada's emission methodology. I don't believe that we could meet that target as it's currently set out, but it's not saying that Canadian farmers can't reduce emissions. And I think there's going to be a lot more recalculations required for this nitrous oxide measurement the more the model becomes developed, because Canadian farmers are adopting a lot of these practices and they are being shown in these national emission estimates.
Perfect. And with that, we do have some questions coming in, Josh, so I'll pose those to you now. Our first question, do we have any knowledge of how the 30% reduction was determined by the federal government?
I don't believe so. 30% just seems to be what is generally put out in a lot of these national targets. Like Canada's first nationally determined contribution was a 30% reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels. Quite a few countries also use this 30% as kind of a benchmark reduction. And when you look at like something like the global methane pledge, it's again a 30% reduction in global methane. So I don't know the significance of that 30%. It does definitely seem to be something that comes about when a target's set. It's usually going to start off at 30.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Our next question: who has decided to include the EENF tool in the methodology?
That would be Ireland. I believe includes a urease inhibitor when applied with urea. And Japan, I believe they include a nitrification inhibitor within their methodology. Their approaches are very simple compared to something like Canada's, where they just use a single factor. So maybe oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to stop sharing. Use a single factor. So it would just be, I believe it's like a 20% reduction if they switch from an inorganic source to a source with a nitrification inhibitor. It's a set factor for all nitrogen applied with that inhibitor within the country. So it doesn't vary based off environmental characteristics or production types. Japan, I believe they have a separate one for tea production and then other crops, and without the nitrification inhibitor being applied.
Really interesting. All right, next question. Are there any technical improvements on fertilizer / potash production that could lead to emission production? This might mean reduction.
I don't know. That's something that I have not spent much time looking into with emission reductions resulting from fertilizer production, or where could emissions being reduced from fertilizer production. I've mainly focused on on-farm emissions, and then with the fertilizer-based emission reduction target, that's also focused on on-farm and not so much on the production stage. So unfortunately, I'm not sure.
All right, our next question. If fertilizer emissions are reduced by 30% of the current levels, what is the impact on Canada's total emission reduction goals?
I should have written that down. I think it's about 1% reduction in emissions.
Perfect.
So it wouldn't be large in the national for national emissions.
Perfect. And we did have someone reply, thanks. We do have time for one more question if folks are interested, or we can move on. So I will just give you one last minute to submit any questions on this section. And if not, we will be moving on to our next section. And seeing nothing coming in, we will take a pause on Q&A for now, and I will hand it back over to you, Josh, to go into your second section of the presentation.
All right, thank you. First off, I'd like to apologize for the amount of text on that slide. But so going through the AFC discussion document, as well as some of the research that we were doing at the time, we've identified enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers as really being an essential way for meeting an emission reduction target, or just in general reducing nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural production. Again, in the case of the AFC document, they estimated that universal adoption of EENFs would reduce or would account for about 62% of the total emission target. And this kind of shows that without near universal adoption of these products, meeting this target would be close to impossible, or would be impossible. So it is going to be quite important to figure out ways for encouraging its adoption. So if these targets are to remain voluntary and something is not mandated, producers are going to need to see a positive return on their investment. Farmers aren't going to reduce farm incomes. This is a business, so they do need to be beneficial, not just on an environmental standpoint or an emission standpoint, but also they need to be beneficial financially to producers. Now, within Alberta, through its tier system, carbon offsets have been used to encourage enhanced efficiency fertilizer adoption. And for our adoption through the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol, NERP. On paper, NERP is extremely well suited for meeting the fertilizer-based emission reduction target, or encouraging the adoption of the practices that will enable producers to meet the fertilizer-based emission reduction target. But it has suffered from extremely limited participation, which does suggest that there are other barriers or things that are keeping people from, one, participating in the program, and two, adopting some of these practices. So to get a better idea of what some of the potential mitigation and potential emission mitigation and changes to farm finances, we ended up conducting a case study on EMF adoption for Alberta wheat production. And what we ended up looking at was the change in net revenue for producers. We did struggle to get on-farm cost data. So we ended up focusing very much on the change in the net revenue. So it's a bit of an odd cost benefit analysis in that sense. To estimate emissions, we did use a modified version of Canada's national inventory methodology. And what we looked at was, what we added in was a fairly simple variable to, or a factor to allow us to decrease emissions by a set amount for different enhanced efficiency fertilizer products. This was based, or the discount factor was based on a review that we conducted earlier this year, where we ended up looking at a number of meta-analyses and then finding like the average effects across those projects. Initially, we did start off by trying to find Alberta specific information and Alberta specific research. However, we did find that what work that has been done has been fairly limited within the province, as well as within the prairies in general. Very much of it has been focused in Ontario or in the United States or China. What we ended up doing was conducting what's referred to as a Monte Carlo simulation, where we simulated field level data based off of township level weather data and AFSC risk zone yield data. So for each township, we generated 10,000 fields, which would just be a different combination of expected rainfall or expected effect of these different products, or expected effects of these different products. And we estimate this for each of the 3,555 townships included within these risk zones. We then evaluated the change in net revenue for each observation. So for each observation, we estimated a baseline emission level using just a conventional inorganic fertilizer. We then looked at the effects of controlled release nitrogen fertilizer, nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, and double inhibitors, which are urease inhibitor plus a nitrification inhibitor. And we looked at the changes in net revenue when no offset was provided, or so $0, a $50 a ton offset, which is the current carbon price, and then $170 a ton offset, which is the expected price in 2030. If you do have questions about the methodology, I can share, or I'd be happy to share about the methodology or the data a bit further, but for time, we'll jump right into our results. So as you can see, we estimated again for the entire province, and what we're showing within the figure is going to be the median township level emissions. And what we can see is that emissions varied quite a bit throughout the province, with the emissions in the lowest area, risk zone 4, located in the far southeast, being well below 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide a hectare, and then increasing the further west and to some extent the further north you move, except in the Peace River area of the province where it is going to be a little bit different. When we're looking at the emission levels, our lowest simulated field out of the 3.5 million was quite low at 0.02 kilograms, and we had a maximum estimate of 27 kilograms. These are extremely unrealistic values. Just they are going to generate some outliers. So what's going to be a bit more useful for the analysis is going to be the intervals in a bit more realistic range. So even when we look at from the 1st percentile to the 99th percentile, the values do drop up, down, or narrow quite a bit between 0.8 and 2.4 kilograms of nitrous oxide. Or when we look at, say, between the 25th and 75th percentile, so the middle 50% of observations, between 0.26 and 0.86 kilograms of nitrous oxide a hectare. So the next thing we looked at was the mitigation potential and the total offset values or potential offset values being generated. So when we take a look at the mitigation potential, what we can see on the y-axis is the percentile, so the probability of being at or below a certain level, and the changes in emission or the emission reductions, again measured in kilograms of nitrous oxide a hectare. Given that emissions are quite low within the province, approximately 90% or below 1 kilogram of CO2, we can see that like total emission emission reduction or mitigation potential is again going to be quite low. At the median, the mitigation potential was between 0.76 and 0.18 kilograms of nitrous oxide a hectare. And when we start translating that into dollar value, at $50 a ton, you're looking at between $1.14 and $2.65 a hectare being generated with the offset. This value does increase a fair bit at $170 a ton, so between $3.68 or 90, sorry, $3.86 to about $9 between urease inhibitors, nitrification inhibitors at the median value. So again, it is able to generate some revenue for the farmer using these offsets, but they, even at $170 a ton, are not likely to offset the cost of adoption alone. Now, nitrification inhibitors or all ENF products have been shown to significantly increase yield. The values do range quite a bit by type, really between about a 1% increase in yield to as much as 6.5% increase. So with the 1.5 being double inhibitors and the 6.5 being nitrification inhibitors. So what we ended up doing was calculating the change in revenue or change in net revenue, and this was done by looking at the change or estimating the change in yield, then multiplying by the price per bushel of wheat, and then looking at the amount of revenue being generated. I'm helpful with a winner. The amount of revenue being generated from the change in nitrous oxide, that's the carbon price. And we also made sure to include the aggregator fee or the aggregator split. So we chose a 2-to-1 producer aggregator split. And then lastly, the cost of adoption or the premium paid for enhanced efficiency products, where we got the information from a number of different groups, including Nutrien and Coke. What we ended up finding within this is there's quite a bit of range in terms of the change in net revenue. On one hand, products like controlled release nitrogen fertilizer and double inhibitors, shown in the blue and red, resulted in average negative changes in that in revenue. So we estimated values between $11.75 decrease in net revenue for controlled release fertilizers, and quite close, or $7.67 for double inhibitors. Now, when we start looking at the percentage of observations that did have a positive return, it was about 24% when no offset was provided, or 24% of participants ended up having a positive change in the net revenue. And this increased to 26% at a $50 a ton carbon offset, and up to 31% at $170 a ton. Now, double inhibitors were really the interesting case within the whole study, because they did have a very large effect on reducing emissions and were relatively inexpensive. It was quite close to zero. So by including a carbon offset, you were able to see large changes in the percentage of observations with a positive return. So we increased from 13% when no offset was provided to 19% at a $50 offset, up to 107, or to 38% at $170 offset. So that was quite interesting, or what we found to be quite interesting. Now, for both nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitors, we did see large percentage of the observations with positive returns. Over 99% for nitrification inhibitors were found to have positive changes, with the median value at a $44.31 increase in net revenue. And when we compare this to urease inhibitors, urease inhibitors were not as effective at increasing net revenue, but were the least expensive. So we still saw a fairly large positive changes in the net revenue, increasing between $19 a hectare when no offset was provided, up to $22 a hectare with a full, or at $170 a ton. So just to summarize, our findings with this with the presentation was that enhanced efficiency or ENF adoption does have the potential to significantly reduce emissions within Alberta's wheat production system, but those emission reductions are going to be quite small. As a result, the offset value is going to be low and is unlikely to offset the full cost of adoption. However, given the increases in yields, at least from what we found, positive changes in net revenue do appear to be possible even when no offset is provided. This is especially the case with nitrification inhibitors and urease inhibitor product types. Now, this does suggest that there may be other issues that are keeping current adoption very low. I believe it's only about 20% of wheat acres in Western Canada use enhanced efficiency products. And so there could be a number of factors driving this. And so through this research, as well as some other projects that we were working on, where we've interviewed farmers across the province, financial barriers do appear to be the largest, maybe not financial barriers, but the financial benefits of our ENF adoption do not seem to outweigh the cost of adoption. And this is not just the upfront costs, but also some administrative costs, slight changes to production, as well as increased risk, as they were not 100% sure how this will affect outcomes. The second one is a lot of uncertainty around the effects of ENF products themselves. And when we take a look at least the beginning, or we take a look at where we started with our review to see the effects of enhanced efficiency fertilizer products, we really wanted to make sure it was Alberta specific, or at least as specific as we can to a semi-arid environment with using our semi-arid rain-fed environment with for wheat production. And this is something that we just could not find in any amount that was allowing us to conduct meta-analysis on the effect. There's just not as much research as we'd hoped. And then lastly, there could also be the sticker shock of ENF adoption at 12 to or $7 to $12 an acre, or additional $12 to $7 an acre to adopt these products. It does add up quite a bit, and this will make it or the upfront costs may discourage people from risking using these new products without that background information. And there could also be challenges with cash flow at the time, especially when you're buying all the crop inputs or over a certain period, and this may create a lot of challenges for the producer. So looking at what could be done, research really needs to be the driving force behind it. So a lot more field studies within the region, especially in Alberta and Saskatchewan, just given the sheer amount of farmland there is, and maybe prioritizing some of it on enhanced efficiency fertilizer adoption, as it's been identified as the most, at least the most likely way of us being able to achieve these emission reduction targets. The second is ensuring that the carbon offset protocols are going to be, one, simple, and two, specific to a single action. NERP, while very well developed, does require a very large suite of 4R practices. And what at least we showed with our case study, is that offset revenue can be generated for each specific practice, even if it is going to be lower overall. It may be simpler to verify, reducing some of the administrative burdens and administrative costs of participating in it. Rebate programs could also be effective to reduce the upfront sticker shock, but at least in my opinion, with maybe the most effective way would be to develop several consumer-based strategies, even if that is going to be product labeling, to further encourage consumers to be able to differentiate products and to make the selection if they are interested in low emission food production. And also this would decouple the revenue to producers from, say, the carbon tax or the price of carbon, which may be just not financially viable for incentivizing producers to switch production practices. So going into our last group, our participant question.
Yes, so we have one last poll question for you folks. So what could incentivize the adoption of enhanced efficiency fertilizers in Canada? Our first option is carbon offsets. So this would be things such as going to the farmer through their aggregator. We have the offset rebate program. So this is offsets going to the input sale company to reduce the sticker price of the inputs. We have a consumer-based approach. So this is the labeling of agri-foods to differentiate their carbon footprint. An example would be the higher price would exist for more environmentally sustainable products. And then last but not least, we have good old government subsidies to help reduce costs. So we will have you fill that out. A reminder, if you're looking at the Q&A box as well, you can click the thumbs up icon to move a question up to the front of the queue if you believe that it should be asked. I'll also encourage you to put any questions you have now in the Q&A box while we wait for our poll results to come in for Josh, or also for Scott, as Scott is willing to answer some questions too. So if you have UFA specific questions, please indicate that and we would be happy to pose them to Scott for you. And now our poll answers. So it looks like carbon offsets have 25% of the answer, an offset rebate program, also 25%, consumer-based approach, 4%, and government subsidies are 46%. So Josh, I'll let you talk about those before we move back into Q&A.
Disappointed more people didn't want the consumer-based approaches. That's something that I'm very interested in for further research, but makes sense. The offset programs are currently available and developed for things like subsidies, or the rebate programs would be, I would say, fairly easy to implement, and especially over a shorter time period, like 2030.
Perfect. So with that, we will jump right into the questions. Some of these questions came in during your presentation, Josh, and they were kind of relatively touched on, but I do think that they're important, so we will ask them again. Our first question: what is the relative cost of EENF in comparison to regular nitrogen fertilizers, ignoring offsets?
That is a very good question, and I should have grabbed that. It really depended. So we ended up looking at a couple of products and use those as representative values. So for actually, this might be a very good question for Scott, but the values that we used were about, I think it was a 16 to 20 cent premium per pound of urea for ESN, which is what we use for controlled release fertilizer. For Super U, which was the double inhibitor that we used, at least with this, in the analysis, I believe it was between $135 and $145 a premium per ton of urea. And then looking at the nitrification inhibitors and the urease inhibitors, I believe on a per acre basis, it was coming up between $7 and $10 an acre, 75 pounds an acre. That's not off my head, I believe that's roughly around the prices.
Perfect. Thank you, Josh. Our next question: what is the benefit to the farmer financially to meet the 30% reduction goals?
Currently, there's none. So what a lot of the things that a lot of the mitigation strategies have focused on for our adoption. So ideally, it would reduce the costs of fertilizer as they're able to use the fertilizer more efficiently. So reducing their input costs. But in terms of meeting that target, there currently isn't any incentivization strategies available at the federal level. Something like NERP could be used to incentivize at the provincial level, but like I said, there's been very little uptake with NERP. And part of that is could be attributed to like very high administrative costs required for verification, and just the general like low level of revenue being generated on a per acre, per hectare basis, just given the amount of emissions actually being reduced. It's not saying that the percentage of emissions are being reduced is not a lot, but it's just when you're looking at or a third of a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, even a 30% reduction is only about 100 kilos of carbon dioxide or CO2 equivalent, which would, again, is not generating much in terms of value for the producer.
I'd simply add, Sean, I'd simply add on top of that it gets down to economics for our producers. The economics have to work, and if they don't, in terms of just basic economic modeling for the introduction of better and more efficient fertilizer application, then the government has to step in with programming to help, because it gets down to economics. It's really the takeaway.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. I thought that you would have some good feedback on that, so I'm glad that you popped in there. Our next question: can you comment on the fact that the demand of offsets may also go down as the price of carbon goes up due to large final emitters reducing their own emissions, and as the use of coal phases out?
Yeah, that is one of my big concerns with really developing a mitigation or like these strategies around carbon offsets. So you have two factors playing in there. The first one being as the price of carbon continues to increase, there is a lot of incentives, or there's increasing incentives or increasing pressures to find ways of mitigating emissions, which would then continue to decrease, or at least decrease the demand for offsets. And the second being too, as those values or as the carbon price increases, there's increased incentives to start adopting these practices. But at a certain point, I believe it's about 40%, those practices become the benchmark, and it's no longer considered additional, which would then have the issue of that offset might not be as effective and maybe will have to be removed. So it does create, again, that challenge of like, you have two forces, more people want to participate and more people adopt the practices. It's no longer a new practice. It is then we consider, the benchmark, and then is it the most effective strategy to continue to provide the offset for it at that time. So there is that definite challenge.
Perfect. Our next question, where can we find this paper or case study that you're working on, Josh?
So it's current. I believe it's currently up on the Simpson Center website under the publications section. You could also find it on ResearchGate, either under mine or my co-authors. So I believe I posted it for our entire group, but the paper's name is Are Offsets Enough? Partial cost benefit analysis for enhanced efficiency fertilizer adoption for dryland wheat production. Yeah, there is a number of places where it is currently posted and can be found. We can also send out a link with at the end of this with access to it.
Yeah, we'll make sure that it's included in the survey that goes out as well, so people can access it. This next question.
Just quickly, going back to the cost of fertilizer, I just quickly pulled up the paper, just so you have a head-to-head comparison between the different types. Controlled release fertilizer was between 77 cents and 96 cents per kilo of nitrogen. So broke it down to nitrogen content. For nitrification inhibitors is between 20 and 26 cents per kilo of nitrogen. For urease inhibitors is between 18 and 22 cents. And for double inhibitors, it was between 29 and 32 cents per kilo of nitrogen. So just the general range of just the overall costs.
Now, I do notice we are running out of time here, so I would recommend that people in the audience do click the thumbs up under some questions to make sure that they get the ones asked that they'd like to see. But Josh, I'll just ask if you're okay going a little bit over time for us to kind of answer some more questions.
Yeah, of course. Be happy to.
Perfect. And this next question I'll pose to both you and Scott, because I think there's some good perspectives from both of you. Consumers will not pay for an environmental attribute. Do you know if a consumer-based marketing is actually feasible?
Scott, you want to start with this? I could start, I guess. So we have seen a lot of development, even if it's not directly to consumers, but in the middle area. So something like ESG scores, or I say ESG scores might be probably the best example, where crop inputs can be used, or production of products could be used to generate some value added for those in each. Sorry, I have to get my thoughts a bit better sorted out here. So I do think that overall, I do think there is a potential market. Like you look at something like organic, or you look at some of the other there are some environmental things, or something like fair trade, where it's not for everyone. It is still kind of niche, but people participating in it are able to generate. There is a definite premium for those products. One advantage of emissions mitigation is that, like, it is quantifiable, opposed to a lot of other environmental certification labeling, which I do think has a very clear advantage. We can say with a lot of, maybe not a lot of certainty, but these practices will reduce emissions by 30%. And if people are as concerned with greenhouse gas emissions and say climate, which a lot of studies have, or a lot of research has shown, they may be willing to pay a premium for these practices to encourage it. Now, we haven't done the research to look at the actual viability of it, and that's something that we are quite interested in doing, because it does take the pressure off of something like carbon offsets, which will disappear or decrease, or the value of which would decrease over time. So this is maybe an option for producers. It's something that we are, again, quite interested in looking at, allowing the consumer to make that decision and provide them the information to choose what they believe to be important, which might be a bit more reflective of than certain policies.
And Sean, I would jump in by saying I agree with Joshua's comments. There is a market that would be willing to pay a premium, I think is what it gets down to. But bear in mind that we're an export nation. We export to countries all over the world our primary products. And in many cases, they can't afford to pay a premium. And in fact, commodity prices right now are a challenge for many of these jurisdictions. So we have to take that into account in considering this question. It's not just a first world problem. This is a global issue from a food security perspective.
Our next question.
Go ahead. Back to the ESG comment. I'm thinking if this could also be applied to something like biofuels, where you're able to have a better quantification of the emissions being produced during the production, as well as something like the carbon sequestration, and maybe be able to generate, or maybe more effective at encouraging its adoption of these different practices when it's maybe not directly to the consumer, but also to industry that needs these products as a secondary step, and they may be able to generate again more value or more income off of it. But there's a lot of different approaches that can be taken. It's again very new, so it's a matter of being there to actually see if it is viable, which there has been a lot of research in.
Perfect. Well, thank you both, gentlemen. Our next question. From producer groups, it has been determined that EENF products would reduce nitrous oxides by a maximum of 14%. Please advise.
I'm curious to know what emissions are being accounted for in that number. Is it total on-farm emissions would be decreased by 14%, or is it specifically, fertilizer-based emissions? So I don't know how to comment on that without a bit more information. I do know that when we looked at quite a few studies, we were finding that the average effect was between mid to high 30s to very high teens, depending on the source. So nitrification inhibitors and double inhibitors, you're in that 30 to 37% decrease range for fertilizer-based emissions. When comparing it to nitrification or urease inhibitors and controlled release fertilizer, you're in the high teens to very low 20 range. So I'm interested to know what other factors are being accounted for, because it would not decrease emissions from residual management, or there may be limited decreases in indirect sources, or if you're looking at total on-farm emissions, it's not going to have an effect on, say, on-farm fuel use for running machinery. So I'm curious to know what was included within that.
Perfect. Our next question. If you were to come up with a policy to reduce emissions in the ag sector nationally, what would you target and how? What is the low-hanging fruit? Is it crop production, livestock, or transport?
That's a very good question. Right now, I think there's a lot of new technologies that are coming out. On one hand, like again, enhanced efficiency fertilizers do seem to be quite viable or quite effective at reducing emissions. On the animal production side, we also just finished a paper looking at 3NOP adoption for beef cattle in Alberta. And we took a similar approach with these simulation models, and we're finding that we could life cycle or on-farm life cycle emissions could be reduced by, I believe it was like 14%, with and up to as much as 20% with 3NOP use. So there is a lot of potential. I think creating a regulatory environment that does allow for products to come to market faster would be very beneficial. 3NOP is used in, I believe, over 40 countries now for both beef and dairy production, but we're still several years away from having it approved in Canada, just given how Canada has classified the product, whereas some countries it's a feed supplement, in Canada it's a veterinary supplement. So it's very different approach, but it's not countries with poor health regulations. We're talking about the EU and Australia that have it approved it for commercial use. So it's maybe speeding that process up a little bit.
And I'd only offer that I'm not sure there is much low-hanging fruit. That was the term used in the question. These are tough questions, and we're dealing with producers' livelihoods here. So I would offer that is my thought on the question.
Perfect. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We do want to let our panelists go as they, have work to do, and they lead their own busy lives, as I imagine you do as well in the audience. But we want to thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate you taking the time to come join our webinar. And I want to thank our panelists, Josh and Scott. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It really was illuminating to hear from both of you today. Josh, we do have quite a few questions left over, so I don't know if you want to share your contact information with the audience of who they can contact to follow up with around this project, but that might be a good way to end today's webinar.
Sure. Should I put it, like, where should I put that information?
Yeah, you could probably put that in the chat, and then maybe the Alana can share it with everyone in the audience. And then while Josh is doing that, I just want to remind you all that there will be a webinar survey sent out to you after this. Please fill it out. Let us know how we did. We would love to hear feedback from you so we can improve our future webinars. But that's it from us today. Just again, a huge thank you for all of you who came out, and another huge thank you to our panelists.